So I think I get the first question, and I think I only really because I wanted to say the word flash mob. As on Friday night, a group of us at the airport were in a flash mob at the Fringe, and it was just electric out there. The energy at this time of year when the Fringe is on is just absolutely fantastic. We've also heard today, though, about this latent economic strength that we have in entrepreneurship. There's just the potential for incredible vibrancy in that space. But what I was going to ask, probably starting with Lily, I thought she might be the most settled down the end there, is how do we bring that same vibrancy that we get in the Fringe and we feel now into our entrepreneurial and startup space? Or am I just missing it? Is it just there and we do need to do a little bit more to tell the tales?
I think that it's a combination of both. I think there's been a lot of talk about having, aside from an innovation precinct, which is bringing together different industry and research and education capacity, but having an actual incubator or hub to serve as the kind of the soul or the heart or the central focal point of the industry. And I think that's a really important thing. I think one of the things that I reflect on with Renew Adelaide was how much having an organisation that stood for encouraging our experimentation and creativity in place across the city was beneficial in driving a lot of other activity that wasn't related to Renew Adelaide. A lot of people did really great things that weren't through Renew Adelaide, but having that, they all said how grateful they were that organisation existed. It's kind of like an endorsed support of that. So I think that's important. And that also helps people see the stories of what entrepreneurship is. There's a lot of focus a lot of the time on, the high level economic metrics or for startups, what their exit is and what that strategy is. But the stories of how people actually build businesses and what industries they're looking at and what choices they're making and who they're working with, that actually gives other people some of the knowledge or the inspiration to start that themselves or to see what questions they might be asking and unleash that spirit. So I think that, focusing on some more of those stories that aren't just about kind of the investment banker's view of the world, but what does the startup do? What do the entrepreneurs do? What do you do when you're running a business is really important.
That's spot on. Sorry, Professor.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, look, it'll be apparent from my talk that I'm a believer in creating the environment and then letting these things happen naturally rather than forcing them to happen. I reckon, were in the wrong place on Friday night. You should have been in here on North Terrace watching the lighting up of the buildings and that sort of thing. I was, largely because the university buildings were involved, and it was absolutely fantastic. I was interested to walk around and look at what was happening, though. There must have been tens of thousands of people there, I think. You could hardly walk along North Terrace. And if you went around those beautiful buildings that were in the front of the university, again, you could hardly move for the sake of people that were there. There were kids dancing in the spotlight, young kids, medium-sized kids. It was everything you wanted. And if you moved 2 metres further onto the university campus, there was no one there at all. And it strikes me we've got something wrong in the connectivity of the bits that make up Adelaide. We shouldn't be a university with a fence around it. The university doesn't have a front door or anything like that. It's a porous thing in the community. That's just the university, but there are other parts that we need to think about. But how do we expose people to different environments that challenge them and create opportunity for them? That's one small example, but it probably plays out in quite a lot of other parts of the state.
Yeah, great. Now, I saw a microphone roaming, which is just around the front here. Is that okay, Hamilton?
On. My name's Chris Stathy from Hazelwood Industry. I've got a question particularly for Lily. In your presentation you spoke a lot about startups, but there are in fact many mature companies out there that are well-heeled financially with great capability and business acumen that are looking for the next opportunity. What's your economic board doing about making those connections, which effectively would be probably a better outcome for everybody?
Yes, and I skipped over that part of my speech inadvertently. But there is also a focus of the Economic Development Board on kind of scale-up or growth companies, because certainly there's a lot of evidence and discussion around that taking a company that is already profitable and is already at a certain stage and growing that has a significantly quicker impact on jobs growth. And there are a number of programs so that the Economic Development Board has been involved in supporting or finding a home for, including University of South Australia's the Centre for Business Growth, which runs a program around taking companies that are already have a market, already profitable, already been running a while, and kind of a boot camp in how to grow that further and how to look at that. So that's something that we're starting to explore more, and setting up some governance structures around looking at that differently, from the startups to the scale-ups, and what are the different programs that are needed for those, because certainly they're a huge part of the economy and a huge part of driving that.
Thanks, Jim. Penny Gale from the REA. I have a question about universities. Do you think that we have too many universities in South Australia? And do you think that there's enough collaboration that goes across them? And that's for any of you, really.
I think it's probably got to come to me. And you'll understand that I'm sitting here with my Chancellor and many members of my council to the right-hand side, and I don't know what their views are on this. I'd phrase the question differently. I think South Australia concentrates too much on structure and mergers, and it has done for about 30 years. People have talked about this, and nothing's happened, which must tell you that there's some reason why it hasn't happened before now. The observation I would make as a South Australian returning is that all three universities in South Australia are suffering from the fact that their attention is on competing with each other rather than engaging with the rest of Australia and the rest of the world. If I walk around this city, I see multiple institutions, including my own, advertising themselves as the best in South Australia at something. And I have to tell you that the rest of the world does not care. They want you to be the best in Australia at a minimum, and perhaps the best in the world. It seems to me that if my basic line of argument is right, and universities actually are the key to the future, then there's a need for the state to sit down and work out what it wants from its university sector, and following some sort of resolution about that, to then ask the question about structure, but not to start with structure and let that drive outcome. It's a bit of an equivocal answer, and I'll leave it there.
Stephen, something to add?
I would perhaps just add on to that and say probably education's the answer, not universities, because the work that we're doing in the Industry 4.0 task force leads you to the need for a co-education, if you like, the responsibility of employers to participate in the job-ready product that comes from an educational institution. And the model, Siemens is a German background company, but the Germans have been running an apprenticeship model in vocational education for 500 years. It's not new. But this notion that firms have to actually co-participate in the design of the course that they need as an outcome with the educational institutions during the period of the apprenticeship. And we need to perhaps redefine the word apprenticeship into a much broader terminology, that maybe there's a stigma attached to it. Many would say that's not true, but maybe there is. And what we've done as an outcome of the task force work is to acknowledge that yes, the universities are highly competitive. If you throw a chip in the air with money, then you'll get a swarm of seagulls there who want to get part of that money. We, for example, made some extremely large software donations to one university per state, working on different topics per state, and the South Australian one will be shipbuilding, not surprisingly. But it's around saying to a university in the first instance, you'll get the software grant, however, you must actually find a TAFE, and you must give the TAFE kids access to that same software, and you must design a continuum of educational courses, apprenticeships, diplomas, undergraduate and research, that we break down the boundaries that are historic in a way, in how we view those stages or hierarchies of education. And I think there's something in there around challenging that past paradigm.
I'll just add to that, the boundaries you're talking about are actually a consequence of the institutions themselves. They're nothing to do with the needs of students, nor the needs of people who use students. I find it fascinating that we all think that there's something called primary school, which is really different from something called high school, which then stops completely and you do something called TAFE, which is different from university, and so on. In fact, it's all one education system. It's there to unleash human capability and human potential, and actually, increasingly, it's going to be lifelong. You won't even do it at certain times of your life. We need to start thinking about it in that way and not as a series of bits.
Correct. And apologies, Jeff. I was looking at Stephen Halliday in the audience before and got confused. We did have a question up the front. Not anymore? Excellent. Good. Another one in the middle. Here? Okay, we'll start on the side. Thank you.
Michael, my question is aimed at you. Denise McMahon from SA Ambulance Service. You spoke about a backdrop of a positive economy. We're going into a South Australian election with perhaps the most confusing potential outcome that we've ever had. And I'd just like the board's views on what would they ask of whoever ends up in government to try and provide a higher level of certainty for businesses in the coming years?
I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, from an economic point of view, the one thing you need to get right is the policy backdrop. If you get that right, then a lot of the positives follow on from that. But I think there's also kind of another challenge here, really. A lot of those kind of potential positive benefits I talked about, they're there. But it's not going to be like the commodity story that just drops into our laps. You know, we're in the right place at the right time. We had the right commodities to really take advantage of it, and all we had to really do was dig the stuff up and ship it out. Now, all these other opportunities, they're there for everybody around the world, and they're all going to be pursuing them, and we need to make sure that we've got the policy backdrop right and that our leaders are actually pursuing these opportunities as well to make sure we get our share.
Mr. Keogh.
Andy Keogh, Saab Australia. We talked a lot about people, the importance of having a highly skilled workforce. It's critical to all our endeavours into the future. I suppose my focus is on how do we get more people into particularly those areas of STEM, and it seems to be at the moment a bit of a buzzword, like innovation went through that phase a while ago. It's evolving into STEAM, and I know from my own personal experience, my daughter just finished high school last year, and sadly, despite my telepathy of trying to get her to go into engineering or science, I failed. She went off into international relations and law. But I've got one daughter left, and I'm just hoping by the time that she gets through there in about 3 years' time, there will be this groundswell that's driving not just people, but particularly women into these industries which are going to lay the bedrock of the future innovation in our economy. So to anyone.
I can start with that, just a personal passion of mine, and part of it's telling the story of so many, not just women, but people as they're going through, and year 10 is always the year where people decide the rest of their lives in terms of narrowing down their choices, is that I think industry, it's almost incumbent on us to paint the picture, paint the story. People aren't aware of the opportunities that are really out there, and you know, particularly with women as well, who aren't necessarily always going to go down that science front first and foremost. I think probably the job of industry as well as educational facilities to make sure tapping into industry to really inspire young people to get involved.
I'll just make the comment, our Dean of Arts is here today, so she probably didn't want to hear what you had to say about the media and international relationship stuff. 2 comments. I think students are much more clever than people think. I'm a scientist, and I think kids haven't been studying STEM because they don't believe the jobs are really there. And I think they're about to be in South Australia. Last night we had the parents of the enrolling students on the campus at the university, and often with their enrolling students. And I was surprised how many are studying computer science or some form of engineering. And when I talked to the kids, it was quite clear that they saw what's coming with this defence pipeline. They do believe they're preparing themselves for a better future. I think that marketplace will self-correct as soon as people realise we're not talking about turning people into research scientists who've got no job security and don't get paid properly anyway. We're actually training them for really good jobs. But there's a second issue which universities in Australia have grappled poorly with, which I think is very important, and that is I think we need almost 100% of our students to be at least STEM literate. They need to know how science works. They need to know where it can deliver and where it can't deliver. They need to have some understanding of technology because there's not going to be any kind of a job that doesn't depend on those sorts of things. And we're going to have to find more flexible ways to deliver our curriculum so that that becomes routine.
One of the work streams in the task force that we're working on is Future of Work, and it's co-chaired by Trish White, who's the President of Engineers Australia, South Australian ex-minister, and Andrew Detmar, who's actually the president of the AMWU. So the sense of co-designing what that future work looks like. And part of the challenge that Trish White was describing, if Trish is in the room, possibly not, I saw her at the airport last night, no, for Engineers Australia, is that actually the current leadership of Engineers Australia is exactly the wrong group to be encouraging the upcoming kids to take on that profession, because it was dominated by civil engineers, let's face it. And the Engineers Australia's own face has to change dramatically to attract a different type of person in there. That engineering of the future is nowhere near hammers and the amount of steel. It's much more around the software design. It's much more about the connectedness of software tools. If we're using the right software tools in Australia, why can't we still participate in auto manufacturing as an engineer, design engineer, just by connecting into BMW or Daimler somewhere else in the world? You don't physically need to do the last 5 years of the engineering production line. So those sorts of institutions, particularly Engineering Australia, need to recreate themselves in how they go to market on what the future of engineering is.
Do we have any burning questions? Here we are, Cameron England from the Tizer. You don't need to introduce yourself.
No, I'm not him, sorry. No, I'm Mark Goldstone, CEO of the City of Adelaide.
I've done it twice.
The City of Adelaide is a council that has a pro-growth kind of strategy at the moment, and population growth, I think, in South Australia is very important. We haven't spoken about that specifically today. Population growth in the city, I think, is critical. Having a critical mass for a prosperous city is something that we aspire to. We currently have about 24,000 people living in the city at the moment. A large proportion of that, or an unappreciated amount of people, are international students. I'm interested in the view of the panel of the future of growing that pool of international students and the importance of the city, and also just generally how we have a policy change that sees a growth of our population, which at the moment, in my view, is not only slow, but it's skewed towards the larger cities in Australia. Any thoughts?
Well, I agree. I mean, we had a former treasurer who said demography is destiny, and I mean that is largely right. I mean, we've all got the same opportunities, I think, across Australia in a way, but kind of what percentage of those opportunities you get partly depends on the size of your population and whether you can fully capitalise on those opportunities or attract them towards yourself. So certainly that's a very important part of the story overall, not just in the short term, but in the longer term as well. I would say with education in particular, though, this is one of the areas where there is the upside. I mean, the experts who've looked at these sort of things and their projections for the size of the globally mobile student pool and how it's going to increase are just enormous. And that's why the upside is there, and most of that growth is coming out of the Asia-Pacific region, and clearly we're pretty well placed to take advantage of that. So how do you get an extra share of that coming in your direction, I guess, is the question. And as economists, I just think it's all about costs. Are you cheaper than the rest and so on? But in fact, I believe the reality is that when students are surveyed about what attracts them to go to a particular university or a particular city or country, cost is in the list, but it's number 4 or number 5. It's not the main reason they look at. There's a lot of other factors that are more important to them when they're deciding where they're going to go. So it's a whole range of factors, I suppose, that feed into the mix there.
It's an interesting day that you've chosen to ask that question, because earlier this week the Chinese government issued a warning to Chinese students about the dangers of studying in Australia. It's part of the political discourse that's going on, and it's very interesting. It's had an immediate effect on what we look at as we see the Chinese students enrolling, or in this case starting not to enrol at the university, and we gather that's countrywide. We've been checking with other universities. The market, though, is not going away. As China declines, it's quite clear Indonesia goes up, South America goes up. There are many places that are about to develop a middle class and that simply don't have institutions of the quality that they need to train their own people. It's for the country itself to work out whether it wants to do it, but it always seems to me to be almost a no-brainer. I think Adelaide's overwhelmingly a better city than the one I left, largely because of those international students that are in the middle of the city. They've actually made it a more culturally rich place. They've made it a more interesting place than it was otherwise. I don't hear enough in this state about the link between international students and tourism. in Tassie this was very clear. Most Tasmanian tourism is not what you might think it is. It's people who come in on cruise ships and spend about 3 hours walking around the city. It's people who come in from the mainland and go to Mona and then go home. But the family and friends that visit students stay in the state for 2 or 3 weeks. They move around the state and they distribute the benefits of tourism far more broadly than the market itself would do ordinarily. I think there are benefits that transcend way beyond just the short-term economic benefits of the international students, and use them to invent not just or support not just existing industries, but to create a kind of cultural vibrancy, which is where good young people are going to want to migrate and spend their time.
Probably also add to that is that the brand of Adelaide is so important in all of that. We're out there on the global stage trying to attract airlines who often haven't heard of Adelaide before, and so just making sure we're constantly doing everything we can and using that in our decision making. Is it might be marginal, but is this going to enhance our brand? Then that's a good thing, and the collective growth that can come from that is spectacular. And thanks, Mark. I'm going to go to Specsavers in the city later on. But do we have anyone else burning questions? Otherwise, I might have to ask one of my own. I will, because it leads on to my obsession with sovereign risk right now, and Professor have just raised that very thing in terms of education. And maybe I'll put this to Michael, really, is that I've raised that in the context of sort of capital-intensive long-term investment, and for us that's really important to have stability in terms of regulation, decision-making. How do you see that theme, that sovereign risk theme, or the flip side, stability and long-term stable political discourse, creating good regulation, maybe at the other end of the spectrum in the startup phase that Lily's been talking about, or some of the other research collaboration end of the spectrum that we've also spoken about?
Sure. I mean, I think the infrastructure story is actually a good example of this. There's a very long list of foreign investors who are queued up and very happy to invest in long life infrastructure in Australia. A lot of pension funds, investment funds and so on, looking at those long-term assets. We've got plenty of them. But what is noticeable about the surveys they do of this is that the appetite has diminished in the last couple of years. And when you look at what has changed in the background there, one of the things there, some of the things they're pointing to is this idea of sovereign risk. I mean, it's not really anything that was on the scale before, but it is now coming up in these sort of surveys as something that foreign investors are starting to worry about in Australia. Equally, they point to politics as something they're a bit more concerned about than they have been before, and taxation, I suppose, not surprisingly, is the other one that comes up quite frequently. So there's a lot of things going on here in the backdrop that maybe making us look like a less attractive investment destination, and for countries like Australia that rely on foreign investment to keep the economy moving along, then that's a pretty important issue to get right again, I think.
Yeah, great. Anyone else out of the woodwork at this stage? Or perhaps we'll get it last. Oh, we do have one over here. Perhaps Hamilton's closest.
Thank you. Mark Gregory, Flinders University. I've had a chance recently to talk to a number of entrepreneurs through our New Venture Institute, and I've heard some distressing stories. One individual told me that they recently applied for citizenship and weren't able to get citizenship because the citizenship process didn't understand a non-employed individual. I've also heard that people have struggled to get bank loans and other things, and I'm just curious about, we have a lot of enthusiasm and there's a lot of enlightenment around innovation and entrepreneurialism, but do we have, through our institutions, the sort of depth of understanding of the model?
Yeah, I think it's a serious work in progress to actually embed what, when we talk about entrepreneurship or even growing a business, what that actually takes from an individual and what kind of individual is and what that's going to mean for them. There are a number of visas, like in the UK, for example, that are entrepreneur visas, so that if you have funding or venture capital for a startup, you don't have to have a job in order to be employed. And that's a real recognition, in order to have a visa rather, and that's a real recognition of what it actually means to be an entrepreneur and to be driving a new problem and a new outcome. And one of the things I find in major institutions and major companies is just that the shift in mindset required about what entrepreneurial actually is and what solving problems is and looking for new markets and the kind of person that's involved in that and to be really driving for solving the problems that come up as you go. And I've certainly seen in major corporations that's not appreciated, even when they're wanting to engage with entrepreneurs, so our existing companies to engage with startups as well, that there's a big communication gap there. They don't know how to deal with companies that are smaller, so suppliers perhaps that are an entrepreneurial company are not able, they need faster payment terms or they need a quicker outcome from a big company, and closing that gap so that you can actually get the synergies between the mature companies and the middle and the smaller companies and the growing companies is certainly something we need to work on, because there's different pressures on the companies at that stage, and that's certainly something that we'll through the board be looking at, what as part of what's needed to generate better links between research and education. Also, what do you need to do to generate better links between existing companies and startups?
Anyone else? Oh, we do. Penny up the front.
Sorry, I'm just a naturally curious person. We talked about the continuous growth that Australia's had. And this isn't just for you, but that will probably at some stage dip. How badly it dips, it's up for grabs, who knows. But what do you see in terms of, is there enough being done to be resilient? I mean, are we a resilient nation? So when things do go belly up or against the grain, are we prepared for that, do you think?
Well, I think the track record there in some ways speaks for itself. If you think about the last 26 or 27 years, the number of kind of shocks that have hit the Australian economy, including a global financial crisis, and yet we kind of managed to work our way through those processes or those periods, keep our growth story there intact. And I think what we're seeing there really is the payoff for some of the things that were done in earlier years. So I mean, we've got inflation down, we've kept it down, so we could use interest rates pretty aggressively when we needed. We paid off all that government debt, running budget surpluses. It means we could put fiscal policy into play when we needed. And of course, you had a floating currency, which is the biggest shock absorber of all for Australia. And those are the sort of key factors. They're all still pretty much there. Now, we could argue about how much further you could cut interest rates right now if you needed to, given how low they are. But there certainly plenty more debt that we could take on board at the government level, for example, if we needed to do that. So we've still got some policy firepower that other countries don't have right now. And it is, of course, one of the reasons why central banks in other countries like the US are very keen to get their interest rates up so that they can actually cut them again if something goes wrong at some future time. So I still think we're better placed than most, but that firepower is not quite as strong as it was 10 years ago.
I mean, in response to that, I think that the work that the Economic Development Board and others are doing around smart specialisation is a big part of that, because a resilient economy is also a diverse economy, so that while the global outlook is good for our current industries, what happens when that shifts and what changes, and how can you redeploy those skills? So looking at, where are those skills and what are the adjacent industries that they can be, where do we need to grow adjacent industries, is also a big part of building that resilient economy.
Perhaps just to add a piece, I think as a nation we've been resilient because we've been able to duck when something else has happened elsewhere and been more self-contained. But the world is much more interconnected now. And I think our ability to continue to be resilient will mean we have to be able to be globally competitive, not just in Australia for Australia, but in Australia for the world, because that barrier has been broken down coming the other way. Things are coming in much more digital form, much more rapidly. So this sense of urgency to be more competitive will be, I think, a prerequisite for the future of resilience in Australia.
I think we might only have time for one or two more questions, but just over here.
Andrew Abel from the University of Adelaide. My question's for Jeff. From a personal perspective, it's really refreshing to see someone talk about the big problems. I'm just interested to know why Siemens gets into these big problems, NBN, renewable energy, telegraph system when you know it's fraught with difficulties. So why do you get into those? And how do we get that way of thinking more widely distributed amongst industry?
I'm lucky to work for a company that is a technology company, and this the excitement that comes when you see that they're a picture of the future, whether it's energy, whether it's the future of transportation, cities. So we are electrification, automation, digitalisation, and there are some projects. Siemens actually is a bank, better rated bank than most banks in the world. So we have this financial robustness that enables us to go and do those infrastructure projects in the world that you might not otherwise have the appetite or the courage to go do. Now, that doesn't mean that as a CEO that you necessarily last too long if you have too many of those blocked up as failures. So you need to manage that risk, and that's about knowing your domain. I'm very passionate about Australia's infrastructure being much more digitalised, that the next wave of infrastructure is much more intelligent, that we have a much bigger view on how all modes communicate with each other. A city is self-optimising, that the modes of road, rail, bus are interconnected to the energy systems, which are interconnected to what's going on in the buildings. So when you're starting to lay down these plans and infrastructure, it's very, very important that you really create that long vision forward and keep driving and talking about what not tomorrow's solution, but the one that's already 4 or 5 down the track needs to look like. And that gets me up in the morning. What keeps me awake at night is, of course, those failing projects if they happen.
Got our last question for this morning.
Hi, my name is Attilio Pigneri. I'm the CEO of H2U. The company is doing Port Lincoln and all of that. I would like to pick up from the other person. Like, it is refreshing to hear what Jeff has said, because you need to build on the big industries and you need to build on the entrepreneurs. We actually need to shoot for some industries that are a bit further away and see whether there is an opportunity to build something much bigger. I'll just make an example of the hydrogen industry. In the hydrogen industry, I'm quite fortunate. I spent all of the 2000s working on it. There will be 2,000 people worldwide that are the hydrogen industry today. So what's happening in Australia and inside Australia, there is an opportunity to actually be a big part of that, and within 5 years to be a very big player. But then the problem goes back to people. And just my personal experience, while we work with the University of Adelaide, and we got an interest in working towards establishing a bit of a what we call a national hydrogen curriculum across university and TAFE. We've had all sorts of inquiries last week about contractors interested in working with us and all of that. It was great. Not a single inquiry from universities saying, how can we help you train people? And I think it's a challenge to the universities in Adelaide and the TAFE, just like we need people to build infrastructure. And on the back of that, the legacy will be people that can deliver and export skills, just like Jeff said. Otherwise, we'll end up being, with the projects coming on us, with no other choice to actually procure services from elsewhere. And I think there are the very big programs such as the submarines, but that's a reactive way. It's a very big national program. It's coming here, and obviously the universities are aligning themselves for that. But when do the universities start thinking strategically about what are the industries of the future that are really 5 years away from here, and how do we build skills in that direction? I think it's a very important thing, because innovation without people doesn't go anywhere. And similarly, not that something can be resolved at the state level, but the issue of visa, an entrepreneur visa does something but very little. We need strategic skills visa. One example, we've got among the things we're doing, we're developing buses and trucks. We're trying to bring someone from Sweden, which has been managing for a very large Swedish company, all the electromobility programs there, is getting through all sorts of hoops to try and come to major cities in South Australia because the changes to the visa programs. I think the states should actually make some noise at the federal level that we need strategic skills visa, which is very different from skilled visa, because the skilled visa, I mean, I've done it myself as an engineer, and you end up in categories where also, no offense, but Vietnamese chefs, are treated the same way, and that there's a very categories. If we have industries that we're shooting for, we need to be able to attract people and to provide an environment for them. Thank you.
That was more of a soliloquy than my own. What was the question?
But perhaps I'll try to tie that a bit. Yes, this moonshot approach as a national aspiration to say, okay, fine, if we can link those aspirations to some sort of classifications, fast tracking of the necessary visas or skills that coming into the country, I think that linkage makes a lot of sense, if that's what you're suggesting. Yeah.
Agreed. Well, we're certainly at time and have run over a little bit. And so, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for your time this morning. I hope you've enjoyed it. We do have a fascinating list of speakers over lunch who will no doubt have a few telling insights into the direction of our state. But before we move from the morning of economics into the afternoon of politics, everyone actually does need to leave the room into the foyer. There'll be a little bit of a tidy up and preparation for lunch. When you return at 12:30 or in advance of that, please return to the same seat that you have today. And thanks again for your involvement. And can you please all thank Lily, Peter, Michael and Jeff in the usual way.